Good morning, everybody. Well, morning for me. Thank you all for tuning in from wherever you are, and certainly thank you to Adam and Chris for organizing. My name is Kelsey Copes-Gerbitz. I'm a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Forestry at UBC, and I'm excited to share some of the work that has been coming out of the Tree Ring Lab at UBC led by Dr. Lori Daniels, as well as the Social Ecological Systems Research Group at UBC led by Dr. Shannon Hagerman. So within the tree ring community, we're well aware, as Adam has just demonstrated, of the value of dendrochronology for understanding fire regimes and their characteristics and how these fire regimes may have shifted through time. And largely because of the kind of foundations of dendrochronology, as well as our focus on the fire triangle, we often ask research questions and make interpretations about these fire regimes being climate or fuels limited. But through some of the work with the Social Ecological Systems Research Group, we've come to realize that worldview has a really important role to play in how we think about and frame our approach to fire. And so worldview is really talking about the set of beliefs and practices and value systems that shape the way that we relate to the world and also inform our mode of decision making. And so for something as complex as fire, that really kind of crosses lots of disciplines and lots of spheres, it's important to understand whose worldview is informing decision-making and how we can ensure that multiple worldviews are represented. And so we've come to this idea of collaborative dendropyrochronology, which is essentially trying to recognize the inherent validity and expertise of different worldviews and how those perspectives can help to inform the fire conversation. So we've borrowed this idea of collaboration as an experiment from Neil et al. And their work down in Australia, where collaboration is really about the process, something that unfolds throughout the life of the research, rather than a checklist that must be achieved throughout the research. And this is extremely important when working with both Indigenous and local research partners who may have different worldviews, not only when it comes to fire, but also when it comes to the landscape. And this is all, of course, within the context of increasingly detrimental wildfire seasons, such as we had in British Columbia in 2017. The 2017 fire season was at the time the worst on record based on area burned and prompted the evacuation of over 65,000 people, including myself and my field team during my first field season. And this is a photo that I took the day that the fire started of the Central Caribou Complex that ultimately prompted the evacuation of the communities with which we are working for this research. In response to this fire season, the province undertook a review to understand some of the causes and consequences behind the fire season. And really the #1 recommendation that came out of this review was that Indigenous peoples needed to be partners and leaders in emergency management and be included at every level of planning, decision-making, and implementation. And so we know that fire research is extremely important for helping to make some decisions and plan. And so how does that work kind of in the research context with ensuring that Indigenous peoples can be partners and leaders? And so what our collaborative experiment tried to achieve was to work with Indigenous research partners and to work with local research partners to understand better the history of a landscape. When we first set out to do this research, we started by asking, what is the fire history of the landscape? But based on feedback from the collaborators, it became really important to take a step back from the fire history and really think about the broader history of the landscape. And then, of course, think about how this could inform future management. So for a little bit more context, one of our main research partners is the Williams Lake Community Forest. So this community forest is co-managed by one of the First Nations, so the Williams Lake Band or the Tekekul, and the city of Williams Lake. And here we're located in the dry forest ecosystems of the kind of central interior of British Columbia. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can see that this particular block of forest that we're working in is a 6,000 hectare block of forest located in the wildland-urban interface. The city of Williams Lake has a population of about 12,000 people. And the photo that I showed you earlier was actually taken from the west side of the lake that you can see, I think, on the right side of the image there. And so certainly in the 2017 fire season, when the fires came within 200 meters of this community forest, fire mitigation and concerns over fire became kind of forefront to the management decision-making. So what did we learn about this place? Well, we learned that the history of the landscape is people. So as I mentioned, we are within the traditional territory of the Tekekul, who are a part of the Northern Secwepemc peoples, who have occupied this land since time immemorial. There's supporting archaeological evidence in the area till about 4,000 years ago, and within the site, occupation in winter villages. The oral histories and traditional use studies of this First Nation tell us about using this place for fishing, hunting, and berry picking until the mid-1900s. But as with many of these landscapes, it was also subject to impacts from European colonization, which in this place occurred in around the 1860s after the gold rush that happened in the Caribou region. 100 years later, this land was converted to being used mainly for conventional logging, and more recently for community forestry, managing for multiple values. We also learned that the history of the landscape is fire. So this is the fire history chart of 20 plots that we laid out in the community forest to collect information on fire frequency and fire severity. So in this chart, each line represents the kind of ages of trees within one plot, and every red tick is one fire scar that was recorded within that plot. And as you can see, there's lots of fire on this landscape. So between 1554 and 1982, there were 83 fires recorded, for a site level fire return interval of every 5 years. And this is really significant because this is way more than we would expect from lightning ignitions alone in a landscape of only 6,000 hectares. At the plot level, the median fire return interval was around 20 years, and these plots were approximately a hectare in size. And on average, some of those, the fire return intervals were quite a bit longer and quite a bit shorter, so we see an average of about 31 years. And kind of across space, you can see that really the fires are burning in different places at different times. Although there are a couple fires here in 1794 and 1870 that burned across more than 50% of the plots, so across a broader suite of the landscape. After 1870, you can see a clear decline in the amount of fire that coincides with the kind of strongest impacts from European colonization. And then the very obvious kind of fire suppression signal in the 20th century. And when we talked to the elders about some of these things, it became really clear that they remembered landscapes that looked like this. Landscapes that were more open, had more grassland-related species in them, and much more kind of transition and mosaics between grassland and forests. Something that's more akin to having more frequent fire in it. Whereas today, in many cases, the landscape looks like this. Lots of fuel buildup and an obvious lack of fire in these systems. So what happens when we bring these different histories together? We had the privilege of working not only with the Tekekul elders, but also with the archaeologists, as well as the community forest managers, to try to bring these histories together while walking out together in the land. And the first thing that we learned, although we see lots of tree ring evidence of fire in this place, is that the intentional use of fire for the community today is really considered a lost practice. Many of the elders remember hearing stories of their elders using fire intentionally on the land, but because of the impacts of colonialism, that practice has essentially become lost. And so colonialism impacted this community, firstly through the introduction of smallpox into the community, and then through the forceful removal onto reserve lands. And even though in many cases they still kind of theoretically would have had access to these places, the privatization of land and ongoing animosity towards First Nations has really limited their ability to undertake their cultural practices in these places. But what became really apparent in this process was that the restoration of respect for the land was really the key vision that the elders had for how we were going to move forward. And one of the elders reflected and said, "That's why I say I was self-sustained, because we lived on the land, we got our medicines from the land, food, medicines, and technology, and so it looked after all of our needs." And from the management perspective, this collaborative experiment really helped to bring potentially different worldviews together. And the manager reflected and said, "These tours have really helped us as a management team become known to the elders. It's sort of an informal meeting place of traditional ecological knowledge and Western science, and I find that really valuable." So what were some of the main lessons from our collaborative experiment? Well, first, the importance of partner-led research questions and interpretations, whether that was all the way from where we could actually sample our tree rings to avoid any archaeological or cultural sites, to asking questions about the broader history, not just the fire history. And the second was really this idea of reciprocity. What was it that through the research process, we could actually give back to the community? And for us, that thing and the request from the elders was actually to be able to get back out onto the land, which was something that many of them had not been able to do since they were children. So that's 30 years or 40 years or 50 years or 60 years that they hadn't been able to be out on these places to which they were so deeply connected. And finally, this idea of learning together, and each being able to contribute expert knowledge to understand the role of fire in this landscape and the role of people in this landscape. And what the research kind of responsibility is then is to kind of enable these partnerships to form and be able to embed a process for allowing multiple worldviews to come together. And for dendropyrochronology more broadly, I think many of us would agree that we know that fire is part of a dynamic ecological landscape. But what is unique in many of these cases is that it is also part of a cultural landscape. And so it's important to remember that wildfire is embedded in these ecocultural landscapes when we begin to form research questions and make interpretations about these places. Second, that Indigenous peoples have always been there. And in many cases, they had strong links to being the main source of ignitions in these systems. And in some cases, that led to these fire systems being ignitions limited systems. And finally, that Indigenous people have always been there and really are still connected to place. And it is imperative that our research can support Indigenous-led reclamation of place, reclamation of their history, and by extension, decision-making around what should happen in these landscapes. With that, I'd just like to thank certainly all of the collaborators, and there's my contact info that I will leave up. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Great, we've got a couple minutes for questions. So the question, can you tell us a little more about your sampling design? How many trees did you sample per plot? And then each tick mark on your fire chart represents a scar found at least on one tree, correct? Those are three plots.
So within our research design, we had 20 plots where we collected fire scars in a 1 hectare area. And we tried to go for a minimum of 5 trees with evidence of fire scars per plot. And then, yeah, within kind of one line, each tick represents a scar that was either found on one tree or multiple trees. Again, thinking about the importance and maybe different way that Indigenous fire might have affected and created fire scars on a landscape, and the importance of retaining all of that information to be able to make interpretations.
So we have time for one more. And in the meantime, I'm going to thank Kelsey and then ask her to stop sharing so our next presenter can start the video up. And the question was, what is the seasonality of the fires? Are they shifting over time? And what does TEK suggest about Indigenous timing?
Yeah, so that's a really good question and something we're still exploring. We have looked at the seasonality, and as of right now, it doesn't seem to have any kind of very obvious shifts in the timing of fire. But certainly the kind of oral histories and evidence from Indigenous communities, both the one that we're working with and others in the area, talk about the importance of spring burning for maintaining certain cultural species. So it's, again, kind of maybe where multiple worldviews gives us a better understanding than just the tree rings would by themselves.